Greetings, everyone. I'm Simone Sanders Townsend in for Stephanie Ruhle. Election Day is now 19 days away, but more than 8 million Americans have already cast their ballots. And this was the first day of early in-person voting for North Carolina. The State Board of Elections says more than 200,000 people have already voted. Vice presidential candidate Governor Tim Walz and former President Bill Clinton campaigned in the state, while presidential candidate Kamala Harris spent much of the day in a battleground Wisconsin on a swing with 3 different stops. Harris was joined by businessman and surrogate Mark Cuban. Now, Mark Cuban, who criticized Trump's economic plans. And on the swing, Harris called out the former president for his comments at a town hall last night when he said that January 6th was, quote, a day of love.
January 6th was a tragic day. It was a day of terrible violence. There were attacks on law enforcement. 140 law enforcement officers were injured. Some were killed. And what did Donald Trump say last night about January 6th? He called it a, quote, a day of love. But it points out something that everyone here knows. The American people are exhausted with his gaslighting. Exhausted with his gaslighting.
Trump's running mate, Senator J.D. Vance, spent the day in Pennsylvania, where he tried to downplay Trump's comments about January 6th and enemies within, saying Trump would not use the military to go after his opponents. Meanwhile, in New York tonight, Harris and Trump made appearances, well, sort of, at the annual Al Smith charity dinner. Vice President Harris recorded a video for the event, while Trump showed up in person. And while the campaign is in its final sprint, Republicans are rushing to beef up Donald Trump's ground game in swing states. The Wall Street Journal reports they fear, quote, that former President Trump's outsourcing strategy has faltered and won't drive enough voters to the polls in key battlegrounds. With that, let's bring in our lead-off panel. Kayla Gardner is here, White House correspondent for Bloomberg. Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. And Mark Leibovich is the staff writer for The Atlantic. Peter, I'm going to start with you. And let's start with Vice President Harris calling out Trump directly for his January 6th remarks in her stump speech. She has also been going on the offense about, you could say, his fitness to lead. And then tonight, she went after him on reproductive rights and IVF. Do you think all of this is going to land with voters at this point in the race?
Well, look, I think what she's decided to do is she needs to take him on a little bit more directly, right? Joyful warrior is one thing, but she's focusing more on the warrior part than the joyful part. And she's done that these last few days with clips, showing clips of Trump at her rallies, making clear that the things he's saying are the kinds of things that at least Democrats and a lot of independents would find repugnant. The idea that he's going to send the National Guard or perhaps the military to round up people that he doesn't like, who are his opponents. The idea that January 6th, a day of terror on Capitol Hill, was somehow a day of love. She's calling him out day after day after day in this last stretch. I think because she realizes she needs to make the contrast stronger in order to attract those few voters who may yet be undecided, who voted against Trump 4 years ago, but haven't decided yet whether they're going to go for her.
You know, Mark, Vance has tried out several lines, frankly, to address the January 6th riot. You wrote for The Atlantic that Mike Pence is haunting the election because he's a reminder of Trump's actions on that day. I mean, even Walz mentioned Pence at his debate with Vance. Vice President Harris mentioned it in the interview that she did with Fox News. How much of a weakness is the insurrection for not just Donald Trump, but I'm talking about the entire Republican Party apparatus?
Well, the fact is the entire Republican apparatus is not behind Donald Trump. I mean, the fact that his own vice president from the last administration is not endorsing him, the fact that there are no other former Republican presidents, the way Kamala Harris has Barack Obama and Bill Clinton behind her campaigning for her, I think does speak volumes. And why I wanted to highlight Pence here is, you know, he was one of the most slavishly devoted vice presidents in history. I mean, it was almost cringy at a certain point. And even he, who was the most so loyal to him to the bitter end, to a fault, maybe, is not even someone who can share the stage at some point, who can even be on the stage, who can have any role in this campaign, which I think speaks volumes. And I think that's why Democrats in particular keep bringing up Mike Pence, and why whenever there's some kind of a discussion about January 6th, whether it's in a Jack Smith filing or something, Mike Pence's name keeps coming up again.
Okay, Mark is right. Not only can Mike Pence can't be on the stage. He doesn't want to be on the stage. He himself put his name in the ring to run for president, and what seems like eons ago in this presidential primary this year on the Republican ticket, and has been very clear that he is not endorsing Donald Trump. You have that, and then you have these concerns that we mentioned about Donald Trump's ground game, and just Republicans are concerned. It's a close election. How much of a difference will the ground game make? I mean, Donald Trump has outsourced a lot of his work to Elon Musk. And let's just be clear, Elon Musk has done a lot of things. I don't think he's ever got anybody elected. He's never run organization. He's never turned out voters. And this is a turnout election.
Yeah, look, there's anxiety on both sides of the aisle right now, both
for sure,
for Democrats and Republicans, because we're 19 days away from the election. But this is something that we have known, that Trump does not have as many field offices as the Harris campaign. But you could also make the argument that a lot of voters already know Donald Trump. They already have an opinion of him. It is Harris who is still trying to get voters to know her policies, still trying to get to know her. She's still trying to define herself. And really, even as she's doing this media blitz and she's really trying to get voters to get to know her, we continue to hear from people that they still don't know enough about her. And she has such a limited time to do that right now.
You know, Peter, Kayla makes an interesting point, right? Yes, voters do know Donald Trump, but isn't that also why he should have an operation to communicate, infrastructure, if you will? Because the last two times Donald Trump has been on the ballot, he hasn't won. You know, like he lost this election in 2020 to Biden. His candidates didn't do well in the midterm elections. One could argue that the surrogates and the infrastructure is important here for Donald Trump for a different reason than it is for Kamala Harris, but still, infrastructure is important.
Yeah, no, I think it absolutely is. You're right. He hasn't won a majority of the vote any time he has run. He didn't win a majority in 2016, even though he managed to squeak out a win in the Electoral College. He didn't win a majority in 2020. He didn't have the support of a majority of Americans in terms of approval ratings for a single day of his presidency in Gallup polling. That's the first time that's ever happened in history. So he doesn't have a support of a majority of Americans. What he needs to do, therefore, is maximize the turnout of the people who are willing and ready to vote for him. And I hear Republicans talk about this all the time, about how they don't have the ground game that they want to have, that the Republicans were months and months behind the Democrats in getting this organized and set up. The Democrats, in fact, have an advantage that may make a small difference, maybe a half a point, maybe a point in some of these battleground states. But if you're talking about states where a half a point or a point may be the margin of difference between the victor and the loser, that could make all the difference in the world. So you do see a lot of Republicans worrying that Trump is not maximizing the advantages that he does have.
Mark, look, can we just take a turn and talk about this new biography of a senator, minority leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell? And the biography actually reveals that Mitch McConnell has privately called Trump all kinds of names, but McConnell told the Associated Press, whatever I may have said about President Trump pales in comparison to what J.D. Vance, Lindsey Graham, and others have said about him, but we're all on the same team now. McConnell is voting for Trump after calling him despicable. And I should also note that the only reason we know he said this is because McConnell recorded himself and then gave those recordings to the biographer. Like, I don't know, this is something out of a movie. Like, what is happening here, Mark? Break it down for us.
Well, what's interesting is that, McConnell has said all that stuff. He said it in the past. It's not a surprise. But when asked about it, he immediately threw J.D. Vance under the bus and Lindsey Graham, too. He brought them up. He said, oh, well, they've said worse. I mean, he didn't get to the point where they're all on the same team until the very last line of that, which I think was pretty telling and kind of Mitch McConnell's own way to communicate his own displeasure with this. Look, this is not, Mitch McConnell does not have a real, a lot of persuasion, certainly with the Trump base these days. But this is exactly the kind of thing that the Trump campaign would not find helpful having out in the news in the last couple of weeks of an election. The fact that yet another really top ally of his the highest-ranking Republican, certainly in the Senate, has very little use for him. Also, it certainly can't help, but also I do think it's telling that J.D. Vance got roped into this immediately thanks to Mitch McConnell.
I mean, he was the first name that Mitch McConnell throws out there in that statement. I do think it is notable. Okay, something else happened today that people might have missed. A former marketing executive from The Apprentice is apologizing for, quote, creating a monster. He's talking about Donald Trump. I should note that this comes after the NDA that the executive apparently signed has expired, and that is why he said he's speaking out now. He apologized for taking so long. Do you think this matters at this point? And were you struck by these revelations? It kind of flew under the radar today. There was lots of news, and this was not necessarily at the top for some people.
Well, look, the brand of Trump as a businessman has certainly stuck. I talk to voters all the time who, even undecided people who say Trump's a businessman, they think America should be run like a business. So in some ways, she's right. He is a brand, but I think that is why it was so smart for Kamala Harris to really utilize Mark Cuban the way she has, because he really has a similar brand, and she's really appealing to people who are economic-minded, business-minded, people who maybe don't like Trump personally, but could be worried about how a Democrat could impact their wallets. And she's really trying to kind of appeal to some Republicans, independents who are really focused on those things.